Good evening. I'm Dolores Johnson Hurt, President of the League of Women President of the League of Women Voters of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Welcome to this forum on the gender wage gap. This past June 14th, women across Switzerland took to the streets, screaming together for 1 minute as part of a protest for gender equality. The gender pay gap was one of the issues screamed about. Our presentation this evening is part of our recognition of Women's Equality Day in the United States. It was on this day, August 26, 1920, that the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was certified. While women in this country could legally vote 100 years ago, we are still far from being equal to men in many areas, a situation which occurs around the world. In another example, Black women had to work until August 23rd this year to equal the pay white men received at the end of last year. The COVID epidemic has drawn attention to the work done by women every day as being systemically important. But no matter the occupation, white women, Black women, Latino women, and women of Asian Pacific heritage are paid less, ranging from 80 cents to 56 cents or under on the dollar compared to white men. To draw attention to this pay inequality epidemic, the League decided to partner with 11 other female headed organizations to examine the problem and discuss what we can do about it, even here in Mecklenburg County. We hope you gain information, insight, and inspiration to make a change from this program. Please welcome now tonight's moderator, Yolanda D. Holmes, PhD, Chair of the Mecklenburg County Women's Advisory Board.
Thank you, Ms. Dolores, and greetings, everyone. Research has shown that women working full-time in the U.S. are paid 82 cents to every dollar earned by men. Since the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, this has now forced a large portion of the population to work remotely, and this has increased the layoffs that are now in the horizon. Women will have a higher risk of suffering greatest and the greater penalties in their earnings. The consequences of this gender pay gap or lower lifetime earnings will follow women throughout their retirement, where women will receive less in Social Security and in their pensions. So tonight, the League of Women Voters and their coalition partners, or the Coalition for Pay Equity, will focus on the issue of gender pay gap. During this virtual discussion, I hope you will understand that this is the first in a series of action-oriented events that is necessary for us to be committed to making equity in earnings a reality for women. Our agenda tonight will include the lived personal experiences of an African-American woman who, in her own words, will share a touching yet compelling story with us. We will also hear information about the facts and the data surrounding the gender pay gap. We'll also be enlightened with statistics from the national, federal, and local level regarding our fight to close the gender pay gap. We will have a question and answer segment with our speakers, and then we will close this virtual discussion with specific action items that women can support. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Miss Yvette Townsend Ingram. She's a former educator, currently serving as a board member of the Democratic Women of Mecklenburg County. She's the Director of Data Management at Ward Circle Strategies in Washington, D.C. Listen as she shares with us the best advice she's ever received, a Black woman's perspective on pay equity. Yvette?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here with you and share just some of my experiences with pay inequity. So with a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctorate, more than 25 years of experience, superb references, and a great work history, I've yet to make a six-figure salary. Over the years, with each job denial, I've wondered if it's because I'm a woman or because I'm a Black woman. I do believe that if I were a white male, I would most certainly have a strong employment history with a six-figure salary to boot. Women must repeatedly prove ourselves. We audition constantly to stand out, and we're forced to compete with each other as if there isn't enough to go around, not enough chairs at the table. I'm currently in such a situation with my current job. I can tell you from my lived experiences, the best advice I ever received was this: you must work twice as hard to get half of what they've got, and you can define your they, it's relative. And also, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And that, of course, is from the phenomenal Shirley Chisholm. But I want to add, too, if they don't give you a seat at the table, sometimes you might have to bring your own table. So that's the best advice I've ever received.
Wow. And Yvette, thank you so much for sharing that inspirational yet telling experience in which so many Black women have faced and can relate to exactly what you're sharing. We appreciate you for doing that. I just want to ask, how has that compelled you to continue to move forward in this fight in closing the gender pay gap?
I give my time and my talent every day to groups that proactively work towards equity. Like right now, I'm on the Issues and Resolution Committee with the Democratic Women of Mecklenburg County. I co-wrote the resolution for North Carolina to become the final state needed to ratify the Constitution to include the Equal Rights Amendment. Many people think the ERA is already passed, it's not. I'm currently working with the team on the Community Relations Committee, reviewing the language of the City of Charlotte policies and ordinances through a lens of equity so that we can make recommendations. So there are so many ways that we can get involved, and the best way is action through policy, changing policy.
Great. Thank you so much, Yvette. We appreciate you taking the time to share your best advice you've received. Now, remember, to our viewing audience, we would like to hear from you throughout this segment and this discussion when we get to our question and answer segment. So please put your questions within the chat box so we would be able to hear and address some of the questions that you may have. So next, we will hear from our first speaker. Our first speaker is Ms. Kate Nielsen, and she is the current Director of Public Policy and Legal Advocacy with the American Association of University Women. Kate leads this department by ensuring that AAUW's policies and government relations work at the federal, state, and local levels are adhered to. She also works to ensure that she devises grassroots field strategy and oversees the organization's national voter education program and the Get Out to Vote campaigns. She manages the legal funds as well. So I would like to introduce to you our speaker, Ms. Kate Nielsen. Kate?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you all. As you just heard, my name is Kate Nielsen. I'm AUW's Director of Public Policy and Legal Advocacy. And while I certainly wish that we could be together in person tonight, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to connect with all of you. And I think in some sense, maybe this is better because more people can join in the conversation. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about the legislative landscape surrounding pay equity in the US. I'll cover some of the high-level research about the gender pay gap, the federal landscape, the state landscape, and some employer level policies. I'll conclude with some action steps, and then we'll look forward to questions at the end. So what is the gender pay gap? The gender pay gap is a comparison of women's and men's median earnings. We often say typical to refer to median because it's the person right in the middle. Half the people earn more and half earn less. The annual earnings ratio for 2018, which is the most recent data, was 82%. So the pay gap is about 18%. Next slide, please. While the pay gap has steadily narrowed over time, it's nowhere near being eliminated. And in recent years, progress has actually stalled. The gap has narrowed since 1960, due largely to women's progress in education and workforce participation, and also to men's wages rising at a slower rate. That does not mean our work is done, however. Next slide, please. The pay gap affects women from all backgrounds, but its effects vary among different demographics. The picture shown here lays out the pay gap by race and ethnicity among full-time workers in 2018, as compared to white, non-Hispanic men. You can see that workers who are Hispanic, Black, American Indian and Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander had lower median earnings than white or Asian women. But all women were paid less, on average, than white non-Hispanic men. And all women within each racial and ethnic group are paid less than men of the same racial and ethnic group. Next slide, please. The pay gap also varies by state, but it exists everywhere. This chart, which is actually a year old and uses 2017 data, but there haven't been huge changes. The earnings ratio in North Carolina is 83% now, and the state ranks 14th among all states in DC. New data is actually going to be released in a few weeks, so look out for updated resources. So what causes the pay gap? The pay gap itself is more complicated than a single number, since it summarizes a huge diversity of women and life circumstances. The origins of the pay gap are also more complicated than a single cause. Women and men have always participated in the workforce in different ways and have been treated differently by employers. And though those differences have shrunk over time, they still contribute to women being paid less than men. One major cause of the gender pay gap is what researchers call occupational segregation, the tendency for men and women to work in different fields with different levels of compensation. Another substantial cause of the gender pay gap is different patterns of work. Women tend to work fewer hours, are more likely to take time away from the workforce to care for family, and are more likely to need flexible work schedules. In addition to these factors, research evidence points to the impact of bias and discrimination on women's pay relative to that of men. If you're interested in learning more about the origins of the pay gap and how it affects different populations differently, I suggest taking a look at AUW's research report, The Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap. As I mentioned, new data is coming out soon, so you can expect an updated version in the next few months. Next slide, please. So let's turn to legislation and practices that can hopefully fix some of these problems. I'll start with a quick history lesson. The Equal Pay Act, which is part of the Federal Labor Standards Act, passed in 1963. When President John F. Kennedy signed the legislation, he noted the Equal Pay Act was a, quote, first step. The reality is that a law in the books does not mean automatic change, and economic, social, and cultural factors impede implementation. The Equal Pay Act is a critically important law, but it hasn't been updated since 1963. Moreover, courts have weakened the law over time. Over the last 57 years, because of the actions of those courts, but also because of more thinking and experience about where holes exist and how discrimination works in practice, we figured out new ways to combat discrimination. As such, it's vital that we update the Equal Pay Act. So before I tell you about the ways that we propose Congress fix this important law, let me just tell you what the law currently is. So under the Equal Pay Act, it is illegal for an employer to discriminate within any establishment between employees on the basis of sex by paying wages to an employee at a rate less than that paid to an employee of the opposite sex for work that requires equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and which is performed under similar working conditions. There are exceptions to this if the payment is made pursuant to a seniority system, a merit system, a system that measures earnings by quantity or quality for production, or, and here's the critical piece, a differential based on any factor other than sex. That piece, a differential based on any factor other than sex, is a loophole that has been interpreted to create a huge hole in the law. As a fix to that hole, And with new ideas about how to prevent discrimination on a broader scale, Congress introduced the Paycheck Fairness Act in 1997 and has introduced the bill with some modifications in every Congress since. The bill has several provisions designed to both close the loopholes in the Equal Pay Act and to provide further protections for employees who are facing wage discrimination. These include clarifying the reasons employers can use to justify paying their employees differently, prohibiting pay secrecy and enabling workers to discuss or disclose their wages without fear of retaliation, prohibiting the use of salary history in hiring decisions, augmenting the damages available to wronged employees, allowing for class actions, collecting pay data to allow employers to see if there are any problems and allow the EEOC to identify discrimination, and providing for training, studies, and an award for employer compliance. The bill has come very close to passing several times, including passing the full House of Representatives with bipartisan support in March of 2019, but it's now blocked in the Senate. This is the main legislative vehicle we are striving to pass to address the pay gap. But in addition to the Paycheck Fairness Act, two other pieces of legislation are perennially considered by Congress: the Fair Pay Act and the Pay Equity for All Act. The Fair Pay Act tries to get at occupational segregation and mandate that employees who are in equivalent jobs, as opposed to equal jobs, are paid equally. Women's jobs are often paid less, even though they require similar skills as those dominated by men. For example, house cleaners who tend to be women are often paid less than janitors who tend to be men. And we pay daycare workers, largely women who care for children, less than valets, largely men who care for cars. This bill would try to level the playing field and undo some of these systemic disparities. The Pay Equity for All Act would prohibit the use of salary history in the hiring process. Sometimes an employer will request a job applicant's salary history in order to determine a new hire's pay. But this seemingly innocuous practice can actually have major repercussions. If a worker faced a pay gap and thus lost wages at one job, perhaps because of bias or even outright discrimination, basing her next job's salary on the one prior only continues that pay gap. Relying on salary history to set future salary assumes that prior salaries were fairly established. So salary history questions can, in fact, introduce bias and discrimination into the recruitment process of a company that's earnestly trying to avoid it. But what does prior pay have to do with a worker's ability to perform in a new position anyway? And shouldn't a worker be compensated based on what her skills and the job in question are worth to the new company, rather than based on a different job that she did in the past? This bill would prohibit employers from engaging in the practice, something that many states and localities have begun to do in practice that recent research indicates is working. In addition to this important pay equity legislation, we note that to fully address inequitable pay, we have to fix many other underlying problematic practices in the workplace and in our culture. Women bear the brunt of childcare responsibilities, and this can have cascading effects. If a woman is paid a little less than her partner, and one person has to stay home with the children, the person with the lower salary will likely be the one to do so. Then when that person goes back to work, their earning potential may be stunted. This reality is exacerbated by expectations around who will provide the care, both regularly and during emergency situations, if a kiddo's sick or something to that effect. And the burden of care goes beyond children. Many families are also providing care for parents and other family members, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this is to say, we need legislative solutions that respond to the very real needs of families. And families aren't necessarily just made up of one working parent, one stay-at-home parent, and 2.5 children. Finally, I want to touch on educational access, since educational attainment also directly ties to wages and the pay gap. Women carry a larger debt burden than men, and low-income students, many of whom are women, often have trouble accessing financial supports to get through their degrees. We need robust interventions to ensure students can access education, pay for it, and not spend their lives in debt afterwards. Next slide, please. So everything I just spoke about in the federal space is applicable at the state level as well. And states can be fabulous laboratories of democracy, trying out new ideas and letting the good ones trickle over to other states or up to the federal level. We've seen this with salary history bans, for example. We've been closely tracking state progress with pay equity legislation in the states since 2015. Every year, roughly 70 to 85% of states introduce legislation on pay equity. This is an extremely popular issue that polls very well. As just one example, in a recent poll in Michigan, 84% of active and likely November voters said they support new laws to provide women more tools to get fair pay in the workplace. Since 2015, on average, 6 bills passed the state level each year. But 2019 was a banner year, with a dozen states passing new laws. I think this shows the desire to act on this important issue, and also that there are a lot of different solutions to this pervasive problem. What works in one state can inform things to try in another, but depending on the landscape and appetite, different states can also try a variety of different solutions. For example, in 2019, Alabama passed a pay equity law. Now, I'm not going to argue that it was a strong law. If it had been proposed in a state like Massachusetts, I would have been opposed to it. But given the political landscape in Alabama and the fact that it was one of only 2 states that didn't have any pay equity legislation on the books, it was a huge win. At the same time, each of the last 5 years, California has enacted a new law to combat the gender pay gap. The state's ability to enact and try different legislative solutions is incredibly useful, not just for citizens of that state, but for everyone to see how the theoretical policies look in action. It's worth mentioning, just as I did at the federal level, that passing legislation that fits in the bucket of, quote, pay equity legislation will not alone be able to close the gender pay gap. We need to raise the minimum wage, eliminate the tipped minimum wage, relieve the burden of student debt, ensure all workers have access to paid family and medical leave, ensure access to health care, including reproductive rights, stop sexual harassment in the workplace, and undertake other poverty-reducing measures. All of these provisions are necessary to get at the underlying causes of pay disparities. Next slide, please. Which now brings me to policies at the individual employer level. While it is paramount that we can change state and federal policies, employers also need to be mindful of their practices and do the hard work of eliminating the pay gap internally. During the hiring and recruitment process, employers should post salary ranges for jobs so bias or previous pay disparities don't creep into the process. Similarly, they should eliminate the use of salary history to set wages. They should also practice blind resume screening as another way to guard against implicit bias, as well as offer trainings and guidance on how to combat implicit bias. Within their day-to-day practices, employers should be mindful of recruiting, hiring, and promoting underrepresented applicants and employees. This should be done intentionally and systematically. Employers should also create pathways to leadership and leadership development opportunities for underrepresented groups. Finally, employers should conduct regular pay audits to assess their pay practices and detect inequality so they can deal with it head on. Next slide, please. So I've just thrown a lot of wonky research and policy at you, and I'm sure you're wondering, what should I do with this information? The first thing you should do is look into the research further and understand the landscape of your state legal system. If you're interested in pay equity or think that you or someone you know might have a problem, look into your existing state law and understand the scope of the protections that are available to you. You have a right to a fair paycheck. But beyond that, I want you all to become advocates. Advocate for yourselves and advocate for your elected officials. AUW has excellent resources to help you engage in strategic ways and learn how to take action, such as writing letters to the editor or lobbying your elected officials. On our website, you can sign up to become a member of our Action Network, so you'll receive alerts and effectively channel your voice. Next slide, please. You can also become an expert negotiator and encourage others to do so as well. AUW's Work Smart salary negotiation program trains individuals to know their worth and advocate for themselves. These skills translate beyond negotiating for a new job or a raise, so we encourage everyone to take the free online course. Next slide, please. Finally, I implore you to vote. We cannot change policy without elected officials who will address our concerns and fight for our interests. Do the hard work of researching where candidates stand on the issues you care about, and check out the AUW Action Fund for help with this. Then canvass and campaign for them and vote them into office. Next slide, please. With that, I'm going to stop. I'll look forward to your questions after our next speaker. Thank you very much. Dr. Yo, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Kate. You've shared so much important information for us that I was just so excited. I didn't even unmute. I'm excited about what the next action steps are going to be for women And we want to be able to hear from our viewing audience. Please share your questions in the chat box. Share your questions that we may address, because I know many of you have lots of questions for Ms. Kate Nielsen. And for those of you just joining us, we just heard a phenomenal presentation from Ms. Kate Nielsen. She is the Director of Public Policy and Legal Advocacy at the American Association of University Women. So please put your questions in that chat box. There's a lot of great information for us to talk about and questions that we'd like to have answered on this forum tonight. So as we continue to move along in our program, our next speaker comes to us from North Carolina. Her name is Miss Mary Stover, Williams Stover. And Ms. Stover serves as the Executive Director at the North Carolina Council for Women. There, her primary mission is to advise our governor, the North Carolina legislator, and state departments on the issues impacting women in North Carolina. As a leader of the advocacy agency, Mary works to raise awareness, collaboration, and serve as a resource to groups and individuals working on behalf of women. I introduce to you Miss Mary Williams Stover. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Yo. And I am so delighted to be with you all this evening on Women's Equality Day celebration. It is quite a monumentous day for us to be together talking about pay equity. It's really special, and it is in line with the purpose of the Council for Women, which is to educate and build awareness about the information so that all of us can make more informed choices, that we can advocate for change, and that we can create a state where everyone, particularly women, can thrive and achieve our best selves. So what I'm going to share with you is information compiled by the Institute for Women's Policy Research. It is a series compiled by the organization that was commissioned by the Council for Women, part of their work with regard to the state of the states. And it gives us a chance of looking at this information. By the Council for Women. I'm sorry, my phone is talking to me for some reason. So we are going to talk about the data and then talk about recommendations. A lot of what you will hear from me mirrors what Kate has said, but I think it's worth repeating, and it helps it to sink in, right? When we hear good information multiple times. Next slide, please. As I said, this report is compiled by the Institute for Women's Policy Research. They are a think tank organization that compiles a range of information around issues that are relevant for women specifically. Next slide, please. The Council for Women has issued a series of reports. In 2017, we issued the first report, which is the status of women employment and earnings, which you'll hear a little bit about today. Last year, we issued the status of women health and wellness, health and well-being. We certainly know that your employment and your earnings is tied to your capacity to access health and health resources. We also released this year the status of women in North Carolina political participation report. The Institute for Women's Policy Research also releases other reports, and I encourage you to visit their website, iwpr.org, in order to learn more about that information, as it does compare North Carolina to other states in the nation. Next slide, please. So what we know is that we have work to do. What we know is that when we look at how North Carolina compares in terms of our national ranking, is that we rate currently 32 in terms of a woman's median annual earnings. We also know that their distinction, which you heard earlier, in terms of what women earn compared to men doing equal work. We also know that 36% or at least 57% of women are in the workforce. So not only are we representing over 51% of the population, but we are representing a majority of the labor force in many ways. So we are working women. We also know that women represent 41% in managerial and professional occupations. So where does this lead us in terms of our national ranking? We've lost some ground, but we're doing well in terms of holding our own. So we're rating a C level at this point in time. That's not an A or a B, which as parents, we tell our children, right? C is not acceptable. It's not acceptable for North Carolina either. So overall, we've increased from a D, which is what we'd earned the last time we did the study, but we'd have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. Interesting enough, I always get the question, well, what state has earned an A in that ranking? And I don't know if you can guess, but it is the District of Columbia, right? Which is not officially a state, but it does benefit from federal government employment. And so that is why they have an A rating. Also, Massachusetts, Boston is a key aspect there. They earn a key rating of a B+. So this is highlighting for you our current status of women report. A lot of the information that women benefit from hearing comes from other women, right? Just as we heard earlier. So I encourage you to visit our website and hear and learn more about the stories of these women who were featured in our report. You see women who are serving in some non-traditional careers, such as Sheriff Paula Dance, but you also see women who are offering and leading institutional resources, such as Lillian's List or the League of Women Voters President, Joe Nicholas. So just want to let you know that this information is available to you on our website. Next slide, please. So when we look at where women are earning higher levels of salary in our state, we see that women in the major metropolitan areas have a higher level of earning income. So women who are in the Triad area, in the Triangle area, Orange County, Wake County, Durham County, tend to have higher levels of earnings. Of course, Mecklenburg should be listed there as well with higher earnings. But we also know that where women are living in rural communities, they're experiencing lower levels of earnings, such as Sampson County or Robeson County. And so we don't think that's right. We don't think that women should earn a salary based on where you live. You should earn the salary based on your skills, capacity, and resources and expertise, right? Next slide, please. So I said we were making progress, but when you really think about it, this progress is too slow. At this current level and at this current rate, we will not see equity until 2060. 2060 is when we would reach the level of equal pay in North Carolina. And so that is really unacceptable for us because women are heads of households also, right? And so it costs me just as much to buy a loaf of bread as it does my male counterpart. So again, we have more work to do in terms of closing that pay gap. Next slide, please. So when we talk about what that means if we were earning equal pay overall, we would see a $6,000 increase in the amount of money on average that women are making. I could certainly use that kind of money. It would also mean more money for our whole economy as well. So women who have the same level of education, the same level of experience would see over a 19% increase if we had equity. So it just sort of makes you mad, really, and it makes you think more about what we can do in North Carolina to change this dynamic, because we must change it. Next slide, please. You heard earlier, there is a disparity based not only on gender, but on race. And so overall, when we look at who is earning what in North Carolina, we see that race and ethnicity definitely plays a factor in terms of the median earnings. Hispanic women are making less than half of what white men are making. And so that is definitely, as we look at our, for example, Mecklenburg, definitely major metropolitan area, very diverse. We need to have more equity for all of our women in our communities in terms of our annual earning capacity. Next slide, please. Education matters. There's no doubt about it. The more education you have, the more money you're able to make, except it seems as if a woman really still never catches up. We heard the sister tell us earlier about being highly qualified, having a PhD, and yet still not reaching the six-figure salary. This is not just your story, this is the woman's story. So you look at this slide and you see that a man with less than a high school diploma makes more than a woman with a high school diploma. It almost seems as if the more education you have, the wider the pay gap. So you do see that you are making more money. The green bar indicates the earning ratio for women. So that earning ratio is increasing with every level of education, but you're not catching up, right? So we need to look at all the strategies for closing that gap. We do need more education to secure good jobs, but again, education alone is not the solution. Next slide, please. Women's labor force participation is also a key issue here in terms of who's in the labor force. We see as we look across our state that, again, there are many, many factors. If you're working in a major metropolitan areas, Mecklenburg has a high level of women participating in the labor force, 65%. Also, again, the major metropolitan areas have a high level of labor force participation as compared to our lower rural areas that have a lower level of workforce participation. But we also know that those workforce participation, as we heard from Kate, there are many factors. Women tend to work part-time. Women tend to bear the responsibility of raising children. And so childcare, I don't know if you've paid for childcare, but you know the cost of childcare is almost equal to an undergraduate education these days. So there are many different factors that keep women out of the labor force. Next slide, please. And this just highlights the labor force participation by race and ethnicity. So you can see that, again, women are in the workforce, but they are not in the labor force on the same level as males are in the labor force. So overall, there are more men in the workplace, but when you look at it by ethnicity, you can see there are Black women and Black men are equal. Almost more Black women are in the labor force than Black men are in the labor force. But you look across the scale here and you see that there is not equity here. This is really interesting when you look at who's in the labor force, and it also bears to, makes you think about what kind of support systems we need, right? Women with children under the age 5 are less likely to be in the labor force than men who have children under age 5. So who is staying home and watching the children, right? This is what we're seeing. So we see women who have education who are leaving the workforce because the cost of childcare is a barrier. So you're choosing to stay home. And that is what we see here with this slide. Next slide, please. Women tend to work in jobs that are managerial or professional occupations when there is the opportunity to do so. And so they're not in the non-traditional careers. We are working in the managerial and professional occupations. And that's what you see here. Asian and Pacific Islander and white women tend to be more employed in those professional positions than Black, American Indian, and Hispanic women tend to be. And so while we have high levels, at least 2 in 5 employed women in managerial occupations, we still don't have equity across all of our racial and ethnic groups. And so we need to look at how we can close that loop as well. It's not just opening the door, it's making sure all of our sisters can come through that door and have equal access to those positions, because those positions also tend to pay more health care. They tend to provide more benefits, right? Those people who are working in those positions right now are more likely to be teleworking. So we have to look at how we can have more equity in those areas as well. Next slide, please. I love the opportunity to talk about the solutions and what can be done. And you heard Kate talk about many of them, and I agree with all of her recommendations. If I had to choose, I guess, 3 recommendations to make policy changes, you heard about barring salary history. That's a huge barrier. A lot of people don't know how much of a barrier that is. If you come into a position at one level, it's hard to step up and make 10, 15% more in your next position because your employer is looking at how much you made in the previous job. Governor Cooper passed Executive Order 93 in April of 2019 that barred the use of salary history for state employees and state agencies. So while we don't have the federal law, we do have at least the capacity within North Carolina, and that law is in effect as an executive order. But I'd like to see more employers take that route because it would make for a more level playing field in that regard. Number 7, expand publicly funded childcare. That is such a huge barrier for women. Also, supporting more women business owners. That's something all of us can do. We can open the door and advocate for more loans for women business owners, more access to funds for those owners as well. And we can talk with our young girls about pursuing careers in non-traditional fields, making sure that career counseling doesn't segregate the kind of information that our young students get, but that they're exposed to those kinds of opportunities and conversations. Not enough of that is happening in the school systems today. Next slide, please. This is the organization that helped to produce this study, the Institute for Women's Policy Research. They can be reached at iwpr.org. Also, you can reach our organization if you're interested in seeing more of the information on the status of women political participation at North Carolina Council for Women.gov. The other thing, I certainly concur with Kate's recommendation. We talk about federal policies. We need to think about who's representing us at the federal level. We need broader representation. That means voting, people. It also means completing the census. Every 10 years, we do a US census. We are only at 40%. 40% of people in North Carolina have yet to complete the census. The deadline is the end of September. If we don't get a better census count, we will lose millions of dollars for North Carolina. Those dollars pay for transportation. They pay for health services. They pay for helping our elderly. They pay for education. So it's all connected. Your vote matters, completing the census matters, and knowing what policies to advocate for matters as well. Hope this information has been helpful to you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Williams-Stover. You have just heard from the national level from Ms. Kate Nielsen and federal policies, and now you've heard from our state level from Ms. Mary Williams-Stover on some data, statistics, and information. The purpose is to bring awareness and to educate us in our next steps and how we need to move to get there. And so you've also been enlightened with a personal story from Ms. Yvette Ingram Townsend. And so, Townsend Ingram. And so we are going to take the questions that you've submitted to us and ask our panelists these questions so we may receive answers that'll help us along in the fight to closing the pay gap that currently exists. So our first question is, what is the bill number of the Paycheck Fairness Act in the Senate right now? And what is the prognosis for passage? And I'm going to direct that question to you, Kate.
Hi, thank you for that question. The bill number is Senate Bill 270. And even though I would like to paint a rosy picture, I think given the current leadership in the Senate and also given the pandemic that we're facing right now, that the prognosis is unlikely that it will pass the Senate this Congress. That doesn't mean that we should stop advocating. We need to tell them how important it is to have pay equity, but I'm very hopeful for the beginning of the 117th Congress in January that it will be a priority and get passed in the first 100 days.
Great, thank you. And Kate, I know you also mentioned that even if a bill and or law is passed and written in the books, it does not necessarily mean that it will move as quickly as we need it to move, because there are other cultural changes and other factors that have to take place. Can you expound a little bit more on that for us?
Absolutely. So enacting the law is one thing and absolutely critical, and implementing it faithfully is another issue. So we have to make sure that once we enact good legislation, people know about it and they know how to use it. And this means, for example, so let's take a salary history ban, which a lot of states have enacted and even localities recently. That's only as good as the information around it. So if employees and employers don't know that there's a salary history ban in their community, they're not going to abide by it. So there needs to be, coupled with passage of legislation, a lot of public education about what the laws say, so that we uphold them and implement them and live by them.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So you've heard, not only do we need to be more attentive to what is going on in our state and our federal government, we need to know about it and know how to use it. Similar to us having a card, a jack for our car jack and everything, all the tools to change our tire, but we don't know how to use the tools that we have. And so we need to make sure we know how to utilize the tools that we've been given as we move forward with the actions of closing the gender pay gap. Thank you, Kate. So our next question comes from one of our viewers, and that question is, which countries have the narrowest gender pay gap, and what lessons can we learn from them? And Mary, I will start with you if you'd like to address that. Okay, we'll start with Kate, and we can give some, and Mary, we'll start again with another question for you.
That's a good one. I don't know that one.
So I also don't know the country that has the smallest pay gap, but I do know some approaches that other countries that are doing better than the US are taking. The United Kingdom, for example, in the last couple of years, passed a law requiring companies to publish data on their wage gaps. And we have something somewhat similar in the US. We collect data through a form called the EEO-1. However, there have been a lot of challenges in collecting that data over the past several years. But in the United Kingdom, that data is not only collected, it's publicized. So it's a little bit of a blame and shame kind of game, so that folks see who's doing a good job and who's not. And there can be sort of a race to the top where employers want to be seen as good employers. And so publishing that data can sort of a rising tide lifts all boats.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't want to see a slew of women flocking to whatever country has the narrowest pay gap. Kind of
Not now, anyway.
not now, not now. And so, Mary, you mentioned a lot about voting and ensuring that we do the necessary steps and take the necessary steps to make our voices heard through the process of voting. So a question comes from one of our viewing members. It says, knowing we can vote not only with our ballots, but also our dollars, what companies believe in pay equity that we should support and which
That's
do
a great
not?
question.
Are you familiar of some local and or national companies?
That's a great question. I can tell you that I don't know. I know that there are companies like Salesforce, for example, that receive national recognition because their CEO went on 60 Minutes talking about his commitment to pay equity and doing an annual assessment and an annual audit of their pay across all business lines. And so that's a practice that is encouraged. And so I would say when you are interviewing for jobs and you're looking at future employers, look at and talk about what is their practice to ensure pay equity. Are they doing an audit, for example? I can tell you personally, I learned many years ago that I was not receiving equal pay in my job only because one of my colleagues shared that information with me. I didn't know where to look for it. I didn't even, we didn't talk about, you don't talk about salary. Women will talk about their shoe size before they talk about how much they make, right? It's a secret. Right. And so you don't know. And so shining a light on that information, I believe, is the first step. And it does open the door for negotiation. So I applaud AAUW for its work in teaching salary negotiation skills, but also, again, it's on us to ask the question. I really love that empowerment speech that Yvette talked about as well.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So there's a lot of work that we have to encourage one another and be bold enough and intentional, authentic about our conversations as we encourage one another in this workforce dilemma that we are facing. And so our question from another viewing member, thank you. I was interested in that idea of equal pay for equivalent work, janitors compared to house cleaners, et cetera. So Kate, could you mention again the name of the act or bill related to that?
So it's called the Fair Pay Act, and the concept is called occupational segregation. And while I certainly applaud the federal work that's being done on this, really interesting work is being done at the state level on this to sort of explore different comparators and how equal or equivalent work is treated. And so a number of different states are tackling this in different ways. And I think that there's a lot of really important lessons that are going to be coming out of that in the next several years as we see laws implemented and take hold and see what works.
Great, great. Thank you. And Kate, I want you to just stay right here before us. There's another question specifically directed to you regarding the work with the AAUW. And this question is, how do we work with Charlotte's leadership to provide the AAUW Work Smart workshops once the COVID-19 crisis has passed?
So I think the key thing to keep in mind is that we have a resource that is free and it is online. And free is very appealing to government, and online it works really well right now. So what I would suggest is first that everyone take the course. Again, it's free, just so you can see what it looks like and what it is. I think you'll be a better advocate for the course if you've taken it yourself. And then approach elected officials and tell them about this great free resource and encourage them to disseminate it widely. We do offer in-person courses, but we're not pushing those right now for obvious reasons. And those also come with a fee for the materials and the facilitator training. So I really encourage you to push the free online resource and encourage elected officials to publicize it, pull together meetings where they encourage folks to take it all together, things of that sort.
Great, thank you, thank you. So Mary, a question that is before us is how do we balance pay equity with performance? How do we do that?
Well, one of the things that I heard Yvette say is a lesson learned is that we have to work twice as hard. And I talked about the power of education. And so, however, what the data shows is that those two factors are not enough, right? So having the most education doesn't necessarily help you make the most money. Working all hours of the day doesn't necessarily result in higher pay, because we know often it's those intangibles, right? The who you know kind of factor, the likability factor, the fit, right? And so part of what I love about this session is you are offering tangible tools like the salary negotiation workshop, Work Smart, right? The other tool is each other. I love what Yvette said. If you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair. And sometimes you have to change tables. And it's as simple as that sometimes. You have to really continually look at who's in my network, who can be my sponsor, my mentor, who am I intentionally connecting to? Am I utilizing the resources that are around me? I've often heard that women have a tendency, we work so hard and so long that we forget to look up and network, right? Because you find out about those other opportunities most often by the network. And so I just want to say that wasn't an official part of my presentation, but networking is one of the recommendations, and sponsoring each other, looking for opportunities to make connections, particularly since we still sometimes live in a racially segregated kind of way, right? My friends are people who look like me. And so if I want to break out of that mold, then I need to have someone help me, introduce me, connect me. And I love also what Yvette said about using my skill to volunteer. That's a great way to open your network.
Great. Thank you so much. And also challenge women to not only bring a seat to the table, but why not just you host the party? You set the table, the agenda, and invite the guests and serve them dessert. And then we keep on moving. We keep moving, right? We keep moving. And so a question for you or Kate, how do we actually measure compensation differences to actually see if there is a bias? How would we go about measuring compensation to see if there is a bias that exists in our office?
Well, I can tell you your HR folks would be a great resource there, and also the research that you learn how to do through the AAUW program helps you to research other companies for comparable pay for people that are doing similar work to you. And then you can use that information and make a case. Sometimes the opportunity for change exists, sometimes it doesn't, but at least you have the information and you're able to present it.
Okay. And Kate, what should someone do if they detect an equity problem? Like where do they go? Where would they go for support? Would they go to their HR person or human relations individuals?
So it depends.
Okay.
Sometimes HR can be a great resource, and sometimes HR can be a source of the problem. So
Absolutely.
you should, number one, find trusted family or friends that you can go to for emotional support. So if you engage in a drawn out battle, it can be very difficult, unfortunately. The other thing that you should do is contact the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. and they have great legal resources to help you sue and figure out what the problem is, do an investigation. There's local offices, there's a national office in DC, but that is where I would direct you to turn.
Okay, so for our viewing audience, one of the first steps is to be able to go to your HR personnel, and if that's not helpful, then we can seek some advice from the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. And it brings us into our next question, which is an individual, a viewer asked about when many employers prohibit that discussion of pay at work. What is the best way to find out if there is a pay disparity at your company without jeopardizing your job? And I think that what you just shared led us into that answer for that question. And another viewer asked, people are aware of the pay inequity between male and female. Most conversations revolve around the inequity affecting Black women. And studies have shown that as well, that other women of color, Latinx, Native American, Southeast Asians earn less than Black women. What can we do to ensure that these people of color are also acknowledged and represented in the fight for equal pay?
It's true. I mean, being armed with the data is first step. I love what Yvette said, and that is I continue to advocate for myself. I continue to look for opportunities to expand my network. And let's face it, I believe that's why we see so many Black women starting their own businesses, is because, and also Latinx and other women starting their own businesses, because we're looking for that equity. And that is a great opportunity to expand your network and your earning power.
Yes, definitely. And so with that, Mary, what is Mecklenburg's rank what is Mecklenburg's rank in state of women's pay?
Let's see, Kate, if you have any information while I look up that data, that would be great. I have to go back.
Okay.
Sure. And I'll just add for the question, a couple questions ago about pay transparency and figuring out pay differences at your job. I do know that many employers frown upon that, but you should check the laws in your state, and AUW actually has a good resource for that, on whether it's legal for employers to prohibit you asking that information. In, I forget, about a third or a half, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, of states, it's illegal for employers to prohibit you from asking about that information. So check first, don't get yourself into trouble, but know that just because your employer frowns upon it doesn't mean that they can actually stop you from asking those questions in some states. Check first.
Great.
Mary, did I buy you enough time, or should I talk some more?
Yes,
Let's see. Go ahead and talk some more.
Well, I'll share a fun fact that we did find out that Iceland has the narrowest pay gap. So anyone interested in going to Iceland, that's where the narrowest pay gap exists. Okay. So while Mary is looking for that answer for us for that previous question, I would like to ask you, Kate, what impact would getting the ERA in the Constitution have on the gender pay gap?
So the beauty of the ERA is that it provides another tool in the toolbox. So it wouldn't mandate equal pay, but it would allow us a better tool to be able to challenge pay discrimination. And it would basically raise the bar for those who are trying to discriminate and make it harder for their defenses to stand. Okay,
great. And some of our viewers have commented that your network is your net worth. Our network is our net worth. And so when we talk about just the mentality of men in this gender pay gap, I'd also like to share that sometimes women face other women who have picked up the mentality of men to ensure that pay gaps exist. And how would we encourage a woman who is dealing with a circumstance in her particular field of work where women are also beginning to pick up that mentality of men? And then how do we speak to the mentality of men that there is little motivation for pay equity for women? So we'll start with either one of you, Mary or Kate.
I'm sorry, I just want to let you know that the answer
Okay.
to the where does Mecklenburg rate is in the full report, which is available online. It breaks the counties, breaks down the data by counties. And so you can find that information and more. The other thing about women adopting the attitude, I can't speak for all women, but again, I think that it does connect to having the kitchen cabinet support system. Kate talked about having someone to talk to. That helps you to develop those negotiation skills and to document your worth in that workplace and to continue to look for other options. That's what I have seen. I have seen that men tend to, the men that I have worked with, and I don't want to generalize, after 1 year in the position, in my experience of men that I've hired, 1 year in the position, I'm hearing from them, I need a raise. I have women who have worked in the with me who after 8 to 10 years, I'm saying to them, what are your career goals? What are you trying to do? Let me help you. So we can't get comfortable, right? And have that I'm comfortable here, all is well kind of mentality. Sometimes the best way to increase your salary is to move to another position.
Wonderful. Great advice. Great advice. Did you want to chime in on anything, Kate, regarding that question?
I think Mary did a nice job of covering it.
Okay. And thank you, Mary, for finding that information for us. We can also share that in the chat box if we need to with our viewing audience. And so I have another question for you, Kate, as we begin to wrap up our question and answer segment. AAUW's action alerts are an easy way to provide our legislators with our personal positions on upcoming bills. How do we get even non-AAUW members to sign up to receive those emails?
So you don't have to be an AAUW member to be part of Action Network. So anyone can encourage anyone to head to our website, check out the materials that we have, and become a part of Action Network. And I think that's the kind of thing that utilizing your network, again, is really useful. Talk to your friends about this great resource, show them how easy it is. We call it 2-minute activists for a reason. It takes less than 2 minutes to engage with your state legislators. And I think making it not scary, making it quick, showing you that you can engage with your elected officials in a meaningful way is a great way to empower folks to lobby and to advocate for themselves.
Wonderful, because that's the position that we would like to take. And for those who have already taken that position, we want to learn more about what it is we can do and what actions we can take, action steps that we can take. And another question has come in for us, and this is for you, Mary or Kate. How can women organize as a group to push for pay equity since the onus seems to be on females?
I think there are, if we look at the industry, pay equity is about information, transparency, and advocacy, and also making sure that we are open and pushing women to be open to non-traditional careers and training people. And I know the community colleges are really starting to do more and more of this in non-traditional careers, so that we have that opportunity, and hold your elected officials accountable. Again, it comes back to your vote. If you're going to, or your elected officials are having a panel, ask the question of them. What are you doing to help Mecklenburg become a more transparent community, to have greater pay equity, to pass some of this legislation at the county level? What are you doing? So you do have the power. Absolutely.
Yes, and we do have the power. And Kate alluded to some of what you stated, Mary, earlier in her presentation. And it just seems like it's taking so long for us to close that gap. Why is it? Do we not have the correct elected officials sitting at the table, or once they're elected, they completely just forget about their agenda that they've brought before us? What is taking the process so long from 1962 to 1997 or some other dates that you mentioned, the Fairness Act, Kate? Why is it taking so long?
It's a complicated question with a lot of different factors. I think if we could point to one, we could attack it, but it's so many different factors and they're interwoven together, and it's cultural and it's legal. And so a lot of it stems back to our definition of family and how the economy was built around a family structure that is no longer realistic and frankly wasn't for a lot of families even before. And then it has to do with systemic discrimination and a bunch of other factors that all interweave together, and pushing women into certain career paths, encouraging them to take on specific roles. There's a whole host of things. Some of it is bias, some of it is ingrained, some of it is cultural, some of it is legal. So pick what works for you and tackle that piece, because we all need folks to work on different aspects of it to make change collectively.
Right. And as we've talked about earlier, there are some intersectionalities that most women face. And there are just various components or factors, those variables that affect each woman in a different way, but we all can stand together firmly to push for the closing of the pay gap and decreasing what is existing already. And now we are in 2020. And Mary, I heard you mention that we would not reach a certain level until close to about 2060. And so there is a lot of work that we need to do, 2060. Right. And so our last question, yes, go ahead, Mary. No,
I just said 2060 is not acceptable.
It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. It isn't. And especially if we're talking about our children and our children's children, 2060 is not acceptable even for us right now. So it's imperative that we continue to push the envelope and actually burn the envelope. It's time out for the niceties that we've been using and really, stand in full force, collaborating together, setting the agenda and being able to move forward, understanding where we are locally and nationally, understanding the laws and the policies that guide this particular topic and issue, and knowing that we have a right as women to be treated fairly, not only in pay, but in every other aspect that affects us as women. We have an indomitable will, and we have the strength and the power to do that. And so our last question says, in the fight for pay equity, are there particular steps we can take to close the racial gap between white women and Black women, for example? Are there particular steps that we can take to close that racial gap that exists in this fight for equal pay?
I think we need to look at what societal factors and laws are in place that are holding specific groups back. So while I am a strong proponent and advocate of the Paycheck Fairness Act, it's my job to get that bill passed, and I work hard on it. We need to also consider what isn't included in there that is affecting different groups predominantly. So Black women make up, or women of color in general, make up a majority of the low wage workforce of women who are in that demographic. So we need to therefore work to raise the minimum wage, because that affects more Black women than it does white women. We need to look at systemic racism and how it's impacting different communities in different ways, and look at the policy levers that are going to reach those particular communities.
Great, thank you. And so as we begin to close our question and answer segment and begin to talk about the action steps that we can take as a collaborative effort that we can take, I want to say thank you to our speakers, Ms. Mary Williams Stover and Ms. Kate Nielsen. I'd also like to thank you, Ms. Yvette Ingram, for that wonderful personal story that you've shared, and all of the information that has been brought before us. And so Maria has also shared another fun fact for us as we close out. And that fun fact is the US ranks number 51 in terms of the pay gap, with Nicaragua and Rwanda ranking number 5 and number 6. So there's a lot of work that we have to do here in the US. And so we're going to start right here tonight in Charlotte. We've given you the information. We've set the table for us to come together again. And here are some of the action steps that this Collaborative for Pay Equity has come together again to come together for us to be able to recognize and realize the steps that we can take. And so one of them is participating in efforts to deliver education, training, and awareness about closing the gender pay gap. And so we've established that platform here tonight. And there's more that we can do together, and we will offer more platforms, virtual discussions regarding the gender pay gap and reducing that gender pay gap. A second action that we can take collaboratively is supporting candidates and legislation to eliminate the gender pay gap. And with that particular action item, writing letters, campaign letters, requesting to meet with our elected officials in person, holding them accountable, and helping us to decrease that gender pay gap. Number 3 is pressuring local employers to identify and correct gender pay inequities. You heard Mary and Kate highlight a little bit more on some of the steps that we can take in our own employment, asking the right questions, understanding the laws and the policies that exist, not only within our state, but understanding what exists in our office if we think that there is a high level of pay inequity that exists there. But being able to pressure some of those local companies. Mary stated that for the state of North Carolina, Governor Cooper, he decided to abandon the fact that you have to disclose your pay. And so that no longer happens. We can ensure that that takes place with the local employers that exist as well. Learn how to articulate your skills when negotiating pay increases. Know how to negotiate that. The AAUW has the SMART program that was mentioned, the Work SMART program. So tap into some of the resources that exist for us, and they are completely free. Know how to sit firmly with those employers and negotiate the pay that you know that you are worth, that we are worth. And lastly, participate with this coalition as specific proposals are developed to close the gender pay gap. Wherever you are, connect with the coalition that is not only talking about it, but we are strategizing to take the next steps to close the gender pay gap before 2060. That's 40 years from now. We are in 2020, and there's a lot of work that we still have to do. And so with experts such as Kate Nielsen and Ms. Mary Williams Stover leading and standing on the front lines, it's important for us to take that stand from a local, from a federal, and from a national level to push forward and ensure that we are reducing the pay gap, and it's not moving slowly, but it's moving quickly for us, because we are women who are resilient, we stand firm, we are mothers, and we are educated, we work hard, we have a true heart and spirit, we're caregivers. We are the ones. Heck, we populate the world. Come on. We need to ensure that we are fighting for the reduction in the pay gap that exists for women. We deserve it. And I think that you all should give yourselves a round of applause, but get ready for the fight. We encourage you to do that and to stand with us. With that being said, I would like to thank the Coalition for Pay Equity. This is a group of wonderful women led by the League of Women Voters who were determined to bring this to the forefront. We know that laws and policies and bills have been passed, but not a lot has taken place or happened. And we do not want our children or our children's children to still be fighting from the same place that we were. We have to take it another step forward. And so we thank the AAUW, the Action Network, the League of Women Voters, the YWCA, the Democratic Party of Mecklenburg County, the Reproductive Rights Coalition, the National Coalition of Black Women, 100 Black Women, the Girl Scouts, Hornets Nest, the Junior League of Charlotte, Inc., and last but not least, the Women's Advisory Board, the board that I chair of Mecklenburg County. We thank each and every one of the coalition partners, and we thank you, our viewers, for joining in with us. Contact one of these organizations so that we can continue in the fight to ensure that we are closing the gender pay gap. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate you. To you, I say good night and have a great, great rest of your evening. Thank you.